Hello, everyone. This talk is around a subject that I'm very interested in, and it's about narrative in games and kind of interactive 3D experiences. And it started in my third year at university when I had a 10,000-page dissertation to write, and I just wanted to play video games. So I did my dissertation on Half-Life and the narrative in Half-Life, and got to play Half-Life for 2 months during my coursework, which was fantastic. But as a side effect, I actually learned that Half-Life has a very interesting way that it actually implements story into the game. And I think that's why it's very, very memorable, both Half-Life 1 and 2, and obviously the episodes as well. And so throughout my career, I've always had an interest and done research into kind of narrative design. And at Masters of Pi, we've been building a lot of tools for clients, and this is something that maybe a few people in the room have tried today. It's in the main exhibition hall. And this is Geppetto, and this is a content creation tool in VR where you can animate rigged characters directly in virtual reality, and this is in the Vive. This is me using it. And this is where some of the questions were being raised as we were trying to build this around storytelling and narrative again, because here you were able to create animation experiences in VR directly. And so a lot of the kind of thinking and research I've been doing over the years kind of came back again, and I could start to go through all my notes again and start to really explore with VR just how can we look at narrative and storytelling. And please come and have a go with this. Let us know what you think. It's in a very early stage. But we think there's definitely something unique and interesting about creating content directly in VR. It's something very different than traditional working on a 2D monitor. So before I dive deep into narrative design, there's some really polarizing opinions of storytelling in games, which I think has kind of muddied the discussion a little bit. You've got the ludologists on the left who believe that games shouldn't have stories, the people who think that Tetris is a game, and anything that's got any story in it isn't really a game, and that games shouldn't have stories, and there's people on this side of the camp. And then you've got the narratologists who believe that if things do not have story, therefore there's less meaning, and therefore people get less, well, they'll get less meaning out of the actual experience. I'm just, I don't want to add to this, so what I'm going to kind of explore is something that I think it doesn't really matter about this at all. I think this is just people just arguing for the sake of arguing. There's a different type of storytelling that I've kind of been looking into where I think, well, we'll go to this part first before I go into that. But basically, this is a really good quote around the actual push and pull and why we're getting this conflict between these two kind of polarized viewpoints. And that is the player's participation poses a potential threat to the narrative construction, whereas the hard rails of the plotting can overly constrain the freedom, power, self-expression associated with interactivity. So you've got on one side, people hate the Call of Duty kind of cutscene where you can not shoot any bullets and you won't get killed and your teammates are falling left, right, and center. And it completely breaks the immersion because the content creators have tried to control you so much, and it strips away some of what is good about gaming, and that is the player agency. To the other side of it, where if you give players completely free rein, like in a sandboxy type game like Grand Theft Auto, where sometimes people don't even play the story. They just piss about in this world, and they push against the world, and the world pushes back. So this is why I think, story and narrative have never sat quite nicely in gaming, because you've got this kind of tension. So something that I started to figure out, or something that I thought that could be very useful for gaming and storytelling in 3D environments, and subsequently VR, is environmental storytelling or spatial storytelling, because VR is spatial in nature. It's a very, very spatial medium. You're plonking people into another environment and giving them a sense of presence. And so before I go into some game examples, I want to start in real life. And Disneyland. Walt Disney had a very specific purpose when he built Disneyland. And at this time, there weren't theme parks. They didn't have the word theme in them. They were an attraction. They were just a bunch of attractions in a field where you could go and you go on a merry-go-round and stuff. And Walt was the first person to say, okay, I want to have thematic story in my space. And people called him crazy. They said that people wouldn't ever enjoy that. But he kind of knew that if he was building this, the brand is a loaded term, but a branded space, a story space. If you can build this and you can get people to travel through it, they will feel like they're inhabiting an environmental story as such. And so the Imagineers, they came up with 3 kind of rules for the design of Disneyland. And the first one was structure and theme. Now, Walt Disney was a big fan of the hub and spoke architectural and planning model. And what that is you have a hub, and then you have the 4 spokes that come out. And initially, this enables good traffic flow. What Walt didn't want is he didn't want people to cluster up into parts of the park and just congest it. Everything that was designed about Disneyland was about giving the ultimate experience to the user. They didn't want the users to get stressed. They didn't want them to have a negative experience. They wanted them to feel like they were in this interesting, safe space that they could travel through, that like they're having some kind of adventure. And so in terms of how story works within this, it's thematic. So you get all these hubs, you get Magical Kingdom, you get the Pirates of the Caribbean, you get the sci-fi kind of Rocket Mountain type stuff. And so as you travel from one hub to the next, the kind of landscape changes from one, it ebbs and flows. The music kind of changes as well. And so it's a controlled experience. If we go back to the ludologist versus narratologist, if you're trying to make a story, and I think I was just caught the end of the CryEngine one, where they were trying to figure out how to get people to look in the right place. It's a really big challenge. You've built the story and you've built these characters. You really want to make sure that they actually get the story delivered to them. And what the Imagineers started to figure out is you could actually deliver story through the space. You didn't have to just put it in a cutscene or a voiceover. And sequential experience was rule number 2. Now, this doesn't really address the elephant in the room with VR, and that is locomotion, which is still a bit of a challenge. But the sequential experience is actually what a narrative is. It's a series of events that you place one after the other, and then as human beings, we then generate meaning out of that. And so you can actually do this as well with environments. So Edinburgh, although it was designed in like a classical medieval kind of town where the castle was there was a strategic kind of planning as well, so all the townspeople could run into the castle if they got attacked. But there was also an aesthetic decision when they were designing this. So you can see where we start in Holyrood, not Hollywood, and then you can move right through this main high street, which is like a spine, and then the castle at the end is like a head. But the reason they designed it like this is actually, as the people walk through, they start to see a church on their left, they start to see like maybe the Houses of Parliament, they start to see little nooks and alleyways, and they're building up this kind of sequential experience as they move through the town. It's being delivered to them bit by bit as they go through until they eventually get to the castle. And so they feel like they've had this, it's actually telling a story, but it's through the architecture. And so you get this feeling for the town, you get this, you actually get a memory. It's a much deeper connection because it's actually someone sat down and thought about, what is this journey as someone travels through? And then the third one was visual communication. Now what Walt came up with was a term called the weenie effect. And I think weenie is hot dog in American, correct me if I'm wrong. And what he really wanted, this is one of his most important ones, and the reason being, this was actually to pull people through the space. And they call them emotional magnets. So these are objects that we actually are drawn to, and that by walking towards them, as we can see in this previous one, the castle there is a weenie, because they can see that from the far end here and actually draws them towards that. But by doing so, they actually pass through all these other parts of the town. And in Disneyland, it's the castle. And this was designed in a very specific way because you can see the castle from pretty much any part of the park when you're outside. So no matter where you are, the castle's there, and it gives you a focal point. And there's a real reason, is again, they didn't want to get people feeling stressed about being lost in these spaces. They could always immediately navigate themselves, but it also was thematic. I mean, they could have just put a big obelisk in there or something, but they put a castle in. It was a story, it was thematic. By using these kind of constructed mechanics, they were binding the whole space together. People who were walking through, nothing felt out of place. You suspend your disbelief when you're in Disneyland. You feel like you're walking through Disney's stories, and I'm going to move on to Half-Life now. And when I started looking at Half-Life again, after some of these kind of mechanisms that the Imagineers do, I saw that Half-Life was actually borrowing a lot of this environmental storytelling. Because the main reason is Half-Life doesn't have cutscenes per se. You don't ever get taken out of the character, which I feel is a really big no-no sometimes if you're in a first-person shooter and you get wrenched out and you then watch your character. everything that happens in Half-Life is through obviously the characters talking to you, but a lot of it is also environmental. So last bit, I can't see my notes, so I'm riffing a little bit here. So just before we move on, this is actually from an Imagineer who's actually saying this to games designers. So this is Don Carson. And he says the story element is infused into the physical space a guest walks or rides through. It is the physical space that does much of the work of conveying the story the designers are trying to tell. Armed only with their own knowledge of the world and those visions collected from movies and books, the audience is ripe to be dropped into your adventure. The trick is to play on those memories and expectations to heighten the thrill of venturing into your created universe. So if we think about things like Star Wars, for instance, this is the concept art for the Star Wars part of Disneyland, which looks awesome. What they're saying is that if people go into this space, they already understand the Star Wars universe. You can start playing on that. I know Star Wars also, when they design the vehicles and the landscapes, are based on real places, and they tweak them and fine-tune them. So there's a sense of familiarity to this stuff. So people have something to relate to. So now, let's get to Half-Life. So we can see now that Half-Life immediately has a weenie, right there, smack bang, and when you first get out of off the train and through the train station. And this big citadel dominates the kind of landscape. And interestingly enough, you have the obelisk there, this kind of column here, which was obviously a monument in the town, but it is now dominated by the citadel behind it, because you physically come out and this is what you first see. So it's using the imagery of the environment to kind of tell the story. Immediately, you feel this thing's dominating over you. And just like any good weenie, it appears again and again throughout the story. It's used as a symbolic image, and it gets repeated again and again. And what they were doing is they were borrowing story tropes anyway. I mean, Tower of Sauron, Mount Olympus, Mount Doom, this kind of imagery has been used again, and it's environmental, it's crafted. There's a reason why they're doing that, because they're trying to bind the story together without someone telling you. It's not implicit, it's crafted, and you just feel it. You feel the story because it's your environment. And in VR, because we now actually start to have a deeper connection with the spaces we inhabit, I think this is going to be really, really useful in terms of narrative design. This is episode 1, and we are now leaving, as we've basically, excuse my French, but we have fucked shit up in the tower right at the very end, where it's like this cataclysmic battle that happens at the very top of the tower. Again, this very, very, simple story tropes that they've used, but it was really refreshing, because in episode 1, you then leave. You're now leaving the tower, but it's still being used as this symbol, and then you see all these little rockets fly out. And these, again, Half-Life are constantly using this imagery, and you'll see these again in one of the later levels. Now, this is episode 2, and this I took from a chap called Jim Partridge. And if you're really interested in level design, check out Jim Partridge's YouTube video on this level, because he completely deconstructs the entire level bit by bit over about 40 minutes. It's absolutely fantastic. But whereas he focuses on the game mechanics, I just wanted to focus on the story elements of this. So we go into this level. So here, Alex, who's our companion, she tells us that there's a car right at the very end there, and we have to get that across. So she gives us a little bit of the kind of the goal of the game. But here we have visual cues. These are visual weenies that are spaced in here. Valve, very cleverly, they do this a lot, is they introduce the level and they give you, that you can see it in front of you. You can see where you need to get to. So that gives the player a goal, but sometimes it's never even implicitly, it's not even implied. They will just show you. You instinctively know, right, I've got to get over there, because they've designed it in such a way that you know what to do. And so here is just a short video of something Half-Life does very well. This is, again, stepping into game mechanic territory, but every single little level, which could be treated like a hub, very much, has always got these little things you need to do. They could have just basically given you a doorway and you just jump straight through it. But no, they had to put planks of wood in the way, they put objects in the way, they get you to use the tools that you've kind of been learning in the game, and they do this again and again and again. They're always just giving the player something to do. But it's always thematic, in terms of the objects that you see. I don't know if you can quite see with the light there. But over on the left, which is very, very dark, is actually one of those rockets that we saw coming out of the actual tower. and it's smashed through the window. It's embedded itself in the wall, and there's shafts of light like kind of shining down there into the kind of the rocket. And it's a very, very simple, they didn't have to put that in there, but it's a very, very simple kind of prop they've put in. And you look up, you see the shafts of light, you look down, they guide you to this rocket. And as you start to piece these things together from what you've seen previously, and I know that there's certain towns that you visit where you see a lot of these rockets coming down. This imagery is repeated again and again, and it's all woven around story. And this is another piece that I really like, which is it's really difficult to see, but down there is just basically this like horrible slimy goo stuff that you travel along. And there's like infinite zombies running at you. And up the top here, right up there, you actually have infinite ammo. And what we have here is a chair, some bottles of beer, and a gun just lying there. So someone obviously had sat there drinking beer, just taking pot shots at zombies. And all that is inferred completely from props. No one tells you that. But it just, again, it's continually on theme, it's continually thematic, and it's just using the environment constantly to kind of tell you the story. And so pacing as well is very important. And again, Half-Life does this fantastically. It's a lot like contrast in musical notes, you know, with tempo. When a tempo gets too fast, if you're continually doing that to players, you can stress them out. So what they do is they give you a break here. Alex says, hey, well done, you've done it, because you've pretty much got all the way through and you've fought your way through all these zombies. You look back, and then you see where you've come. You identify the landmarks that you saw all the way up the top. And it kind of gives you a sense of completion as you've worked your way through. And this is about 20 minutes worth of gameplay. And Valve are very, very economical with their level design. And this is pretty much the route that you take on this. And it actually feels a lot more... It feels a lot more open than it actually is. And this is another thing that I think they've done really, really well. And comes back to the Disneyland, the Disney park kind of design is delivering a crafted experience. What Half-Life done is it's an on-rails shooter, pretty much. But you never feel like it's an on-rails shooter. You always feel like you are actually exploring yourself. You feel like you have a choice over where to go, even though you're being just pushed down one way. And the way that they've done that is through little mini games all the way that keep you interested, but also where they open up the space. They put you into little tunnels and they open up again. And I think for VR designers, we could certainly look into this. I know that there's some examples out there in terms of locomotion, room-based stuff with unseen diplomacy, I think, which is enabling you to basically walk around in circles. And you know, you could do things with towers in VR where you're walking around in circles. You know, these guys are being super economical with normal gaming techniques. I think we can definitely borrow this in VR. And so I think that's pretty much it. So thank you very much.